Okay, great. So I think we are live now. So I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, and as well as the speakers. So hello everyone, my name is Izu, and we are Innovation Forum Cambridge, and I'm the head of Innovation Forum Cambridge. Today we'll be talking about climate crisis, as well as innovation and how innovation and how the climate crisis and improve human health. So what Innovation Forum is a grassroots network of more than 10,000 innovators, and we strive to drive innovative technology as well as development by connecting innovators like ourselves, as well as industry leaders and investors. So what we aim to do is really to improve human health and well-being by translating cutting-edge technology into actual product and services. Just wanted to quickly mention our our flagship event that is called Imagine If. So it's a global competition as well as which is an accelerator program for science-based ventures. If you want to know more, you can go to innovationforum.org/accelerator and apply to the Cambridge branch and earn the prize. Without further ado, I'll let my colleague Samara to introduce our first speaker. Samara, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Yuzu, for the introduction. I would like to now introduce our first speaker. So today we're very lucky to have with us Dr. David Aldridge, who is an aquatic ecologist and group leader at the Department of Zoology in Cambridge. His work focuses on freshwater ecology and how we can manipulate lakes and wetlands to restore species diversity. He's also director and co-founder of biomanipulate, a company that has developed a novel and environmentally friendly method of controlling some of the world's biggest aquatic pests. So without further ado, I'll hand over to David.
Okay, is my screen shared?
Not yet.
Not yet.
And as always, if you have any questions, please just put them in the chat.
Is my screen with you now? No?
Not yet, no.
No. Right. I think I've... Oh, hold on.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, right, okay. Hi, well, thanks very much indeed for inviting me along. What I would like to do is to talk about how climate change affects water pollution and how we might manage those challenges using a circular economy model. So what's the challenge? Well, we rely on fresh water for many important ecosystem services. We rely on fresh water for irrigation, for recreation, obviously for drinking water supplies, and also it's a very important resource within industry. And one of the major challenges for fresh waters is nutrient enrichment or eutrophication. And the real challenge with this is that it drives algal blooms. So in this image here, we have a location in Yunnan province in China where I've worked for many years. This is Lake Jiangxi, and it receives a lot of nutrient enrichment, in this case from horticulture, which drives a massive bloom of algae within the adjacent lake. And algal blooms reduce the ecosystem services provided by fresh waters. And they do that in a number of ways. Firstly, the growth of algae and cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae, can make the water very challenging to supply for drinking purposes. The water can taste bad, it can smell bad, and it may be challenging for the water industry to process it. Also, it can be injurious to health. It can carry toxins, particularly related to the blue-green algae, the cyanobacteria, which make it harmful to humans and harmful to wildlife that live in that water. Very often in eutrophic waters, we have low biodiversity value and also low amenity value. So, for instance, it's difficult to go fishing or to enjoy the water resource. And under a growing climate change scenario, it's clear that eutrophication is becoming more and more of a challenge. The details of this figure don't matter, except to say that it's widely acknowledged that under climate change, the water becomes warmer, which allows faster growth of algae. Many climate change scenarios indicate more rapid nutrient runoff into rivers and lakes, which drives proliferation of algae. And also importantly, climate change often leads to a reduction in the zooplankton, the water fleas, which graze the algae. And if we have fewer zooplankton, then we have greater growth rates of algae and more of a nuisance. So the challenge we have really is what can we do with nuisance algae, particularly under growing climate change scenarios? What we're really trying to do is to shift from the state that we have on the left of this figure, where we have an algal dominated system with few ecosystem services, towards the image on the right, where we have clear water, where the freshwater system is providing many more high value ecosystem services. So to do this, as an ecologist, I like to build my ideas around theory. And actually, there's very well developed theory around how freshwater ecosystems, particularly lakes, function. And the details of this figure really don't matter, but freshwater ecosystems operate typically in one of two alternate stable states. They can either be green and pea soupy and algal dominated, or they can be clear water and dominated by bottom rooting plants. And that's what this schematic figure shows here. Essentially, we can either shift from our turbid state, which is where we have lots of algae and suspended sediments, and we can move to a clear water state where there's lots of vegetation. And essentially the turbidity, the algae and the suspended sediments stop the vegetation from growing, but the vegetation stops the turbidity from developing. And the vegetation can do that in a number of ways. It can cut down wave action, it can compete with the algae for nutrients, it can even suppress the growth of algae. And we can actually inject different interventions into this framework to actually manage our system. And the intervention I want to focus on today is adding grazers such as mussels to remove the algae and push our system towards the clear water state. So what's a freshwater mussel? Well, these are very widespread globally. They can live for over 100 years, they can grow to over a foot in length, and they can live in really high densities, at over 200 individuals in a square metre of river or lake bed. And in UK rivers, for instance, they can make up over 90% of the river biomass. So if I jump into the bed of the River Cam in Cambridge, I can find handfuls of mussels all over the place. And each one of these individual mussels can filter over 40 litres of water a day, making them really, really important water clarifiers. And we've calculated that in the River Cam in Cambridge, for instance, during the summer, the entire volume of the river goes through mussels every 2 weeks. We've done work in Bangladesh where the entire lake volume is processed within 18 hours by the mussels. So these are really powerful tools that we could embrace. So let's have a look at using mussel power in action. So here's one example in China where we used the native Chinese giant mussel as a bioengineering tool. This is the lake. As you can see, hopefully in this image, the water is really very green. It's hyper eutrophic because it receives waste sewage, it receives horticultural waste, it receives waste from agriculture. And sometimes a picture paints 1,000 words, and in this case, this image shows what's happened when we've put mussels into an enclosure within this green pea soupy lake. What you can see in the foreground is an enclosure where we've put the native mussels. And within about a month, this is what happened. The water became so clear from the mussels filtering that the light could penetrate far enough through the water column that bottom rooting plants started to grow from the seed bank in the sediment. And these plants emerged, they hadn't been seen in the lake for over 30 or 40 years. And as we saw in the schematic of the alternate equilibria model before, when we get plants established like this, then we can push the system towards the clear water state. So these were very exciting results. Closer to home, we've worked with the UK water industry to use mussels as biological filters to manage water before it goes into water treatment facilities. So in these cases, we've put settlement structures onto floating islands and allowed, in this case, a non-native bivalve, which mussel that's already living in the water, to grow in very high densities on the bottom of these structures and create a biological filter which reduces then the amount of money needed to treat the water before it goes through the waterworks. And one of the things we can do with this sort of approach is to link mussel bioremediation into a circular economy framework. So far, the circular economy framework that I've thought about is demonstrated here. We have our nutrients at the top, receiving, so coming from point sources such as sewage effluent, or diffuse sources such as runoff from fields. We then get photosynthesis generating algal biomass. That algal biomass then goes through the mussels, we get clear water, and then the system starts again. And the real question really is, how can we extract additional value from this cycle? Well, we're already extracting some value, shown here in the green, in that by getting clear water by using our mussels, we get elevated biodiversity, better recreational opportunities, better quality water for drinking and sanitation, and opportunities for higher quality aquaculture. But there are other ways that we can exploit this system. So for instance, if we look at the mussels, some of the things we can do is that we can exploit these mussels as a protein source for human consumption and health foods. We can also divert that mussel biomass into animal feeds. And that's something we've looked at in a bit of detail. So here's the results of a study where we took mussel meal that was growing in reservoirs, and we dried it at 80 degrees to remove the nuisance algae, and ground the tissue and shells to a powder. So we had this nutrient source that was high in nitrogen, phosphorus, and calcium, and we experimentally fed it to egg-laying hens and found that at about a 15% dietary supplement to their standard feed, we got really high growth and brilliant egg production. In fact, the eggs were particularly nutrient rich. They produced really nice yellow yolks, and they didn't taste fishy at all. What else can we do to extract value from this system? Well, another thing we can do is we can start to grow pearls in our mussels. And this is something that we've done in China, and we're currently doing in Bangladesh as well. And the native species of freshwater mussels in these countries produce these beautiful purple pearls naturally. And we can actually exploit that by seeding little spheres of shell into a mussel. We can put about 50 into each mussel. And this allows local communities to make money by selling the pearls. And at the same time, we then get clean water because we've got lots of mussels growing in those water bodies, busy filtering away. So everybody's a winner. Another thing we can do with the mussels in this system is use them to remove pollutants. Mussels can remove heavy metals from the water, and they actually lock them away in their shells, so they're no longer bioavailable. They take them out of the system. And we've just completed a really exciting piece of work which shows that mussels can also remove microplastics from the environment and degrade them. So we can actually improve the environment from by removing some of these emerging major environmental pollutants. Other ways we can derive value from this circular model is by removing the algal biomass and diverting it, for instance, towards biofuels. Another thing that we've been doing is developing microencapsulated diets. At the introduction to me and my work, there was a mention of biobullets, and we have this technology where we can actually encapsulate algae into microcapsules. And this is a schematic of a biobullet where essentially inside an edible coating, we can put our high quality algae, we can add other food quality enhancers, disease control agents for our target organisms, and make these particles just the right size and shape for commercial mussels and oysters and scallops and clams to feed on. So we've been diverting algae into these particles, and because we've scaled up this system, they're incredibly cheap to produce, and these dry powders have a very long shelf life. Very importantly, they're also free from contaminants. So we've got a high value food, which is very stable and easy to use. And we've already shown in the United Kingdom and Spain that we can use these dry feeds to achieve really high growth and survival of mussels and oysters. And we're now moving into Africa, where we're using these particles to allow local communities to produce high quality, safe sources of protein. We actually see this as a real opportunity for helping to address some issues with global food security. Just to finish off with, within this schematic of circular economies, we can also move our model and link it to other circular economy models. So for instance, we can take wastes from biofuels grown on our algal biomass, put those into anaerobic digesters, derive biofertilizers from that system, and feed the waste from that back into our other circular model. Equally, we can take waste streams from our animal feeds, our pearl production, and microplastic removal systems, for instance, take the wastes from that, feed them back as nutrients into our system, and derive further value. So to summarize then, I hope I've shown that eutrophication of fresh water is a growing problem under climate change scenarios, and that mussels really offer an amazing tool for helping to restore ecosystem services. And that by taking a circular economy approach, we can start to identify innovative solutions for environmental management. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, David, for your wonderful talk. It was really interesting to find out more about how mussels and how they can be used to filter the water. We have a question for you in the chat. So this person asks, will the pollutants in the mussel shells reduce their value as animal feed?
Yes, potentially. So it rather depends on the scenario that we're working in. If we're working in really polluted systems, then the way that we would derive value will vary. So if there's heavy metals, then that's quite challenging to then recirculate. If it's other sort of more organic based pollutants, then actually in the processing to create animal feed, often those are broken down. That would be the case with bacteria, for instance. So it rather depends on the nature of the system you're working in.
Okay, interesting. So you've got another question, and this person was a commercial saltwater mussel farmer in Australia, and they ask that in their experience, algal blooms have made the mussels inedible through poor taste. Can your ideas be translated to saltwater?
Yes, absolutely, and we're actually sort of doing both freshwater and saltwater systems at the moment. It's interesting that the comment mentions about the problems with poor taste, and one of the great things we can do with our biobullet is that we can put flavorings into the particles to make them more attractive to consumers, and that's something that we've been working on quite heavily. In fact, we actually manufacture our biobullets on a plant that is used to create, for instance, I think it's 90% of the world's encapsulated menthol for chewing gum. So we're working with food experts to add flavoring. So we've toyed with adding a bit of garlic flavoring or whatever you like, really. The world is your oyster. Excuse the pun. Yeah.
That's great. So question from Samuel. is there any potential to apply this approach to saltwater? We've just answered that. And he's interested in finding out more about microplastics in saltwater.
Yeah, so the microplastic work at the moment, we're looking in river systems. The reason why it's particularly effective in river systems is that you have a linear system where you can actually pass all your water over a biological filter. It's rather more challenging in the ocean where you've got a rather more open, dispersed system. So you may be able to create biological filters in a local environment, but it might be more challenging to clean up a large water volume. Because you can't pass all the water over a single point.
Okay, and I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So one from Alice saying, how would you account for the unexpected detrimental impacts on the biosphere, especially in complex marine environments where introducing certain species in large quantities may have impact on other species?
Okay, so yeah, and this actually also perhaps relates to another question which we might not be able to cover, which is about zebra mussels and their role as invasive species. What we're not trying to do here is to encourage in any way the introduction of non-native species into a new environment. So most of my work is actually about studying invasive species. So it's the last thing I would be wanting to do. Where we have invasive species, we might want to embrace their positive side because they're already so established that we can't actually eradicate them. But what the focus is for us mostly is to be using native species as our biological filters. And in fact, we've done a lot of work that shows that where you find a high abundance of native mussels, you get much higher associated biodiversity because they create quite a complex environment around themselves, and their clearing of the water also allows plants to grow which provide habitat for invertebrates, which are then food for fish. And so actually, as a rule, when we increase bivalve abundance, we actually get better enhancement of biodiversity in the ecosystem. So generally speaking, we're onto a winning thing.
Amazing, thank you. And for our final question, so it's from Wolfgang, and he says that, have you investigated the involvement or the role of algae in actually clearing the excess nutrients or pollutants, and what the effect of removing the algae was?
So obviously the algae are absorbing the nutrients from the water, particularly the nitrogen and phosphorus, but obviously a lot of micronutrients as well. And there's been a lot of interest particularly in the world of algal biofuels, into how we can actually grow the algae and then extract them from the fresh water in an efficient way to then derive value from them. And actually, one of the great things with our mussel system is that the mussels naturally are turning those algae into a much more accessible resource that we can do something with, even if it then goes into producing, even if it goes into sort of anaerobic digesters or something like that. So it is a way of stripping nutrients. And actually, one of the potential interesting avenues with this is that phosphorus is becoming a progressively more and more limiting nutrient environmentally, and obviously it's used very widely in fertilizers, and it's getting to the point now where it's actually economically worthwhile trying to extract phosphorus from wastewater streams and redirect it back into fertilizers. And by growing mussels, we're actually got the opportunity to do this and remove the phosphorus from the environment and reuse it again.
Oh, that's really interesting to know. Well, thank you so much, David, for your time and sharing your knowledge with us today. And I would now like to introduce our second speaker today, and that's Ting Lai. Ting is co-founder and CEO of Ambify, and she has extensive experience in working in healthcare across population health consulting, digital health, and biotech. She founded Ambify to provide integrated hardware and software solutions for environmental health and risk monitoring. So over to you, Ting.
Oh, Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here to talk about this really important topic. So I will just switch over to sharing my screen quickly. Just give me a second. Can everyone see that? Yeah. So yeah, just a quick introduction of myself. Has been briefly mentioned. So I'm Ting. I am currently co-founder and CEO of Ambify. We are a preventative health platform specifically focused on a mission to protect individuals from the negative health impacts of environmental pollution. And just before I move any further, I'd like to invite everyone just to take like a deep breath in. No matter where you are, sitting at your desk making dinner, just take a deep breath in with me. I love doing that because the air that we breathe, the oxygen that we get into our lungs, it fills our body, it makes us feel so much better, it helps us focus. But along with the air that we're breathing, it's not just oxygen that we're breathing in, but also a lot of other different kind of particulates. And specifically, there is a dark side to the air that we're breathing in on a daily basis. The WHO specifically calls air pollution one of the world's biggest invisible killers. And just to put that in statistical terms, 1 in 7 deaths around the world are due specifically to environmental pollutants. And it's not just impacting, developing countries. Over 90% of cities around the world don't currently breathe safe air. And when we quantify this and the specific impact on our healthcare systems is that, it's estimated that air pollution alone costs global healthcare systems over $20 billion a year in annual healthcare costs. And just on the topic of air pollution, before I go any further, just to give everyone a brief overview of what is air pollution. Specifically, what we're talking about is things like particulate matter. So that refers to specific airborne particulates in the air that can come from things like smoke or dust or dirt, and we typically measure them in terms of their size. So PM10, PM2.5, and that's specifically the width of these particulates in the air. Other pollutants, we're looking at are things like nitrogen oxides or volatile organic compounds, and those combine in the air to impact ground level ozone, which we all know has had an impact on kind of the climate crisis, which we're talking about here today. And just to give everyone a better idea, going back to the topic of this event, the climate crisis is a health crisis. What we're seeing is that, air pollution has a huge impact on mortality rates around the world. This comes from data from 2017, and we see specifically air pollution, both outdoor and indoor air pollution, is the 4th highest mortality rate around the world, and it's higher than obesity. And sometimes I find that just crazy to think about when, we look at all the initiatives around the world and people talking about, exercising and eating a healthy diet to live a healthy lifestyle. And, I think we just need so much more conversation around air pollution and how that's impacting our health specifically. Just to give you a better idea of kind of the impacts that this is having on our bodies. Research has shown that it specifically, air pollution has an impact on cardiovascular and on respiratory diseases. So on the cardiovascular side, we're seeing increases in rates of ischemic heart disease and stroke due to the impact of air pollution on premature death rates. On the respiratory side, we're seeing pneumonia, COPD, and lung cancer rates increasing. And so, coming back to the topic of this event, the climate crisis is really only exacerbating this issue and its impact on our individual health. Increased increasing urbanization across the world has led to increased levels of outdoor air pollution. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I'm sure a lot of us have heard about, you know, the wildfires that just ravaged the west coast of America. And over there, you know, west coast cities all across California, Oregon, Washington, you know, they face the worst air pollution that they've had in decades. Just to quantify this, you know, I think on one particular day, particulate matter in the air was measured at over 450 micrograms per cubic meter in concentration. The WHO recommended level of exposure is 10 micrograms per cubic meter. So that's just crazy to think about, right, in terms of the air that we're breathing in due to a lot of these events. And, you know, specifically, what does this have on an impact on an individual basis? You know, we've seen that over 70% of asthma patients reported that air pollution triggers their symptoms. And, you know, it's estimated that the cost of air pollution on healthcare systems is estimated to grow from 20 billion in 2015 to over 8 times to 175 billion in the next 40 years. So we have to do something about it. And, you know, I've just put this slide here to say this is how we currently monitor air pollution in cities. You know, just within the city of London itself, we have, you know, hundreds of air quality monitors that have been installed on you know, lamp posts and across busy motorways. And basically you can go to the LAQN website online, it's all open source data, and you can pull up, you know, you can see what the air quality data is like, you know, near where you are, and it splits it up into nitrogen dioxide, ozone, particulate matter, and you can generally just see what the ratings are. But, you know, one thing that we realized and why we started Amplify really is that we noticed that, you know, we can't get the temporal and spatial granularity that we really need to measure the direct health impacts of air pollution on an individual basis. And what I mean by this is that, you know, even though we have air quality monitors outdoors, you know, what about indoor air pollution? Especially with COVID-19, we're all spending, you know, so much more time indoors. And we really need to be able to know, you know, what type of impact that's having on our health. And so, you know, just to iterate, you know, we believe that, you know, we just need a more efficient way to accurately measure pollutant exposures on an individual level. And how, you know, we split up our thinking is, you know, this is really critical for 2 main demographics. You know, we view it as one, kind of high risk populations, you know, individuals living with these chronic cardiovascular and respiratory conditions like asthma, like COPD. And then secondly, high exposure populations. So, you know, people that have to work on the front lines in, say, construction sectors, where they're faced with, you know, massive dust exposures and working next to, you know, huge diesel exhaust generators and things like that. And we need to be able to know kind of what they're being exposed to and what this impact is having on our health. And so, you know, what we've done at Amplify is that we've developed our own wearable technology for monitoring on a hyper-local basis, so on a personalized basis, what our pollutant exposures are in real time. So basically, you know, we're looking at things like air pollution, like that particulate matter that I mentioned, things like nitrogen oxides, VOCs, ground level ozone. And, you know, interestingly, what we've seen is that, you know, we also have incorporated physiological sensors, because we want to know specifically both our environmental exposures and whether or not we can correlate that with the direct health impact. You know, does this have an impact on heart rate variability, on our blood oxygenation levels, on our respiratory rates? And, you know, that's something that, you know, we're really keen on doing as a company and as a startup. And, you know, just to give you an idea of the type of people that we're working with, you know, I mentioned, you know, in construction, really we're working with that industry to provide them our devices so that, you know, they can reduce occupational illness claims, especially related to respiratory diseases that we've seen increase over the last few decades. You know, we want to put pressure on corporate social governance and responsibility, and knowing that construction is one of the main sectors that contribute to pollution across cities, you know, we want to stop it at its source. So, you know, that's one main industry that we're working with. But then we've also been working with, you know, the healthcare sector, and specifically with, you know, adults with severe asthma, to identify specifically what type of environmental exposures might be, you know, triggering their symptoms, and whether or not we can warn these individuals before they go into such environments so that they can, for example, take a puff of their reliever inhaler if necessary. And so I'll probably skip through this slide, but basically this is kind of the whole network that we've set up in terms of, you know, the wearables and, you know, the whole machine learning layer that we've incorporated into looking at correlating environmental pollutant exposures with their health impacts, and trying to provide our end users with actionable insights so they can eliminate or at least reduce their exposures to harmful pollutants. And I think, you know, I just really wanted to end more on a positive note in terms of, you know, one of the side effects that we're living through now because of the COVID-19 lockdowns is that, you know, we've actually seen falls in pollution levels because of, you know, the lockdown measures. You know, on the right here, I just put some satellite imagery that shows, you know, nitrogen dioxide levels over France and Italy between March 2019 and March 2020, and it's significantly fallen. And, you know, increasing policymakers like, you know, Sadiq Khan here in London, he's really been pushing, you know, air pollution policy in the past few years, and we've seen kind of London air pollution fall in the last 4 years specifically. And what we want to be able to do is, you know, specifically measure, you know, what impacts this is having on our health. And I think this is a really exciting space to be in. You know, we're looking forward to gathering this additional data and having it on an individualized basis, you know, with our wearable monitors, specifically correlating environmental exposures with a direct health impacts. So we can use that to better inform individuals, to better inform organizations, to better take care of their workers, and, you know, policymakers as a whole. So thanks very much for having me. I'm very happy to answer any questions later on.
Thank you so much for your talk, Ting. That was really interesting.
No worries.
So I think we've got our first question, but I might start off by asking the question I had. So you mentioned about how the COVID kind of lockdown resulted in lower pollutions. Do you have any kind of suggestions about how we can kind of maintain this lower pollution without kind of damaging our economy or preventing kind of, you know, things going back to normal?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and it's something that a lot of people are looking into now. And, you know, I think, you know, even Boris Johnson has been talking about it in terms of when we do restart our economies, you know, start back smarter, you know, have greener policies in place. And, you know, we've actually seen that specifically working with the construction industry that we're looking at now. You know, when, you know, construction works restarted, you know, we saw an increase in you know, these companies paying increased attention into, you know, carbon dioxide exposures on their sites, and trying to get more granular leveled data in terms of, you know, both the pollutants that they're producing on their sites, but also how this is impacting their workers, because, you know, we're really seeing it from a specific health impact issue. And I think, you know, being able to quantify that health impact is something that's really going to help, you know, push policy forward, and saying that, you know, yeah, really just kind of push policy forward.
Great, thank you. For our second question, Cian asks, what sensors do you use to measure nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, VCOS, and ozone?
Yeah, so we are currently using optical sensors to measure, you know, those various NO2, SO2, VOCs, ozone. Basically, low-cost sensors have, you know, made massive improvements in the past few years. There have been, you know, some pros and cons with that. You know, we've managed to miniaturize a lot of these sensors so that we can put them on a wearable device, so we can get, you know, personalized exposure monitoring. And one of the really important points that we need to be able to ensure is, you know, the reliability and accuracy of this data. So, you know, within our kind of cloud computing platform, there's a lot of data calibration that takes place. You know, we also have temperature and humidity sensors on our devices, which basically look to auto-calibrate the readings that we're getting off of these VOC sensors and NO2, because that's all impacted by, you know, temperature in the air on that specific day.
Okay, and so following on from that, kind of ask, so what are the uncertainty margins for these measures? I think you briefly touched upon that. Does that have any impact on kind of the work you're trying to achieve?
Sorry, I'm just reading the question now. What is the uncertainty margin for these measures? So at the moment, basically, we're kind of certifying all of our sensors at the moment. They are all different sensors, as you pointed out. Basically, we're looking at getting our sensors within 95% accuracy with the sensors that are being used within the City of London itself. So using those as our ground truth measures.
Great. And Faisal asks, are there any solutions to detect airborne COVID?
We looked into this a lot. At the moment, you know, that was something that we weren't able to do as a company. Airborne COVID, you know, detecting bacteria and viruses on specifically a wearable sensor is very, very hard to do. They are much smaller than the particulates that we're looking at in airborne. So at the moment, we're not looking into that, but I know there are a few companies that have been kind of trying to push this forward.
Interesting. And Pat would like to know if you have any plans to bring your device to the US.
Yes, eventually. You know, we're starting here in the UK. We are a London-based company and working with a few companies in Cambridge as well. But yes, definitely plans to bring it over to the US when we expand.
Great. And will your sensors be made available to construction companies?
Yep, so we are working with a few construction companies now, and so yeah, we're working directly with them specifically to kind of put our sensors on individual workers.
Amazing. And for our final question, I think we'll go to Batsy, and he says, how do the sensors cope with variations in high and low temperature changes?
Yeah, it's a good question. So right now, you know, we have a specific range that we're working with in terms of temperature ranges. We are not kind of approaching it for kind of super extreme temperature ranges at the moment. It's something that, you know, we're still testing at the moment. But all of this is kind of going through lab certification. And unfortunately, I just can't go into further detail.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ting. And I think if there are any other questions, we can come back to them at the end, because we'd like to move on to our third speaker today, who is Michael Evans. Michael is CEO of Cambridge Carbon Capture. He's an entrepreneur and innovator dedicated to finding solutions that tackle climate change. At Cambridge Carbon Capture, Michael wants to innovate technologies that permanently convert CO2 into mineral byproducts. He has a very impressive background and has run 4 successful businesses and secured a total of 1.5 million in government grants up to date. He's also passionate about finding real-world solutions. So over to you, Michael. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Hello. Right, I'm just going to fire up the presentation. I thought I was number 4 on the list, so you got me a little bit by surprise, so bear with me. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Yep, excellent. Oh, and the video works. Brilliant. Right, okay, I'm Michael Evans, CEO of Cambridge Carbon Capture. And I'm going to tell you about a technology we're developing, which is basically carbon capture and mineralization. And what we're proposing is a sort of a circular economy approach to reducing emissions, both with direct air capture, but also mainly reduction of industrial emissions. So if you look at all the sort of models that have been put forward under the COP26 and previous things, and also the IPCC, there's about 300 different sort of climate models that have been put together, but every single one of them, without fail, includes carbon capture, storage, or utilization as a major factor in our goal to reduce emissions. And without it, there's no way that we're going to be able to hit the net zero targets that we've set. So it's a very big part of our strategy to basically save our planet for making it so that we can still live on it in future generations. So it's a really big deal. But the problem is, industry is, there are technologies already. I mean, a lot of the technologies that are employed in carbon capture and storage, for instance, such as removal of CO2 from emissions, injection underground, etc., have been going on for several decades now. So these aren't new technologies necessarily, but what they are is very expensive, and the economic drivers for industry to adopt these technologies just aren't there. We talk about carbon price, etc., and various other sort of incentivization that governments are looking at. But the problem is that unless they're sort of applied across the world, in a world where things are traded internationally, you can't go around sort of disadvantaging your indigenous industries, because obviously they've got a lot of lobbying power. So and this is part of the reason that legislations haven't really been coming forward, despite everybody's acknowledgement that we really need to do something, and nobody's prepared to make the first move. So there's a really sort of big problem associated with applying these sort of technologies. So the main one that everybody sort of looks at as a sort of big savior is the carbon capture and storage solution. So in sort of very brief terms, CO2 is sort of removed from industrial emissions using separation technologies that like using amines and various other things. And this is an energy intensive process. It involves cycling materials through hot and cold in order to first of all absorb the CO2 and then re-release it in a more concentrated form. That then has to be sort of dried, compressed. That's a hugely energy intensive process. Then transported to wherever it's going to be stored. So either this happens by putting it into ships or tankers, or put down pipelines. And there's lots of discussions around using redundant oil and gas pipelines, etc., and using depleted gas and oil wells as storage sites. But the problem is that in order to do these sort of solutions at a global scale and to have an impact on climate change, we need to be considering these sort of solutions over millennia, not over sort of 10, 20 years sort of timescales that we're quite used to looking at with industry. And who's going to be paying the salary for the fella who's going to be monitoring that storage site in 1,000 years' time? They're storing stuff that we've sort of created today for money, but it's costing future generations down the way. And what happens if the stuff leaks? Who's liable for that? Who has to fix the problem? Who has to stop the leak? All these things have to be considered, and this all adds cost to the whole thing. So one way around this is actually to use the CO2, and there's a number of different approaches that have been looked at. So either you can permanently sort of convert the CO2 into something solid. This is often called mineralization. So often some of the solutions involving making concrete from CO2 or using CO2 to rapidly cure concrete. There's other technologies that have been looking at creating base chemicals for plastics and various other sort of chemical processes, even fuels. And I would put the fuels as a temporary sort of solution, because basically when you burn the fuel, that CO2 that you've captured is re-released. So the argument there is that fuel is displacing fossil fuel. So it's a sort of a renewable sort of approach, I suppose you could call it. But things like putting it into drinks is just basically delaying its release, because as soon as you open that bottle of Coke, out pops the CO2 again. So, you know, there's no actual benefit from an environmental point of view from doing that. Other things like energy efficiency improvements. So I mentioned acceleration of curing of concrete. You know, concrete itself actually absorbs CO2 over its lifetime as it hardens, and it carries on absorbing for 10, 20 years after it's been used, and while it's sort of setting. So what you're really doing is just accelerating that hardening process, which obviously has commercial value. But in terms of the environment, that CO2 would have probably been absorbed by that material anyway. So again, it's a sort of a dubious sort of approach, really. But our technology, we've called it CO2 lock technology. It's a permanent capture of the CO2. We're actually taking CO2 and converting it into a carbonate, which is then used as a construction material. And it's locked in this carbonate forever. It's basically, you know, energetically, it's got more energy as CO2 than it has as carbonate. So you actually have to put energy in order to re-release that CO2. So it's permanently sort of locked into that. And it's sort of what happens on the globe, you know, naturally in the world anyway. The CO2 levels in the globe were significantly higher back a few million years ago. But with the creation of the Alps and various other mountain ranges, this pushed magnesium silicates up from the magma up into the atmosphere, where through weathering, CO2 within the atmosphere was brought down, and new carbonates were formed and flowed into the sea and created things like limestone and chalk, for instance. So what we're doing is we're taking that same technology, same sort of process, the same chemistry, and accelerating it and bringing it to an industrial scale. And our technology can be deployed at any scale, right down to domestic boilers, right up to you know, huge power stations. So this is how it sort of works. So we start off with a start material, which is a magnesium silicate. So this is olivine, serpentine, talc, asbestos. They're often sort of mining tailings from other mining operations, so, you know, readily available materials and very cheap. And our technology is around the digestion of those materials to create magnesium hydroxide. In the process of doing that, we also make silica, and we can get access to some of the trace metals that are in those minerals, such as cobalt, nickel, chromium, iron even. And these are very valuable materials. The silica we can sell into the car tire manufacturing market. It can be used in construction material for sands, etc. And the magnesium hydroxide is what we use to capture CO2. So the actual CO2 capture process is very, very straightforward. It's in fact very similar to the sort of processes that are used to remove sulfur from emissions from power stations burning coal, for instance. Where limestone is used as a sort of a slurry to scrub the sulfur out, we use magnesium hydroxide slurry to scrub out the CO2, NOx and SOx, all in one process, to form a magnesium carbonate. And this magnesium carbonate it self-cements, it sets, so you can take the slurry, dewater it, cast it into sort of sheets, which then form construction materials. It's thermally insulating, it's fireproof. Immediately you can see there's a fantastic new market for that sort of material. It can also be mixed with cements to form a ready mix, which can be used in construction for high-rise buildings, etc. Where its fire-proof properties are really useful for the safety of that building in a fire. So lots of really, really interesting sort of markets, and they're very large volume markets as well, which is important because, you know, if we're capturing CO2 at a gigaton scale, we're producing several gigatons of byproduct. So you need very large markets in order to sell those products into, and the construction sector is one such market. So if you take the revenues from all the sort of materials that we produce, and you take away the cost of actually capturing the CO2 and all the capital equipment, etc., amortized over a reasonable period of time, and we're still making around $200 per ton of CO2 we capture. So, you know, quite a significant business opportunity. And when you look at the sort of supply chain, so we've got mining operations, we've got emitters, CO2 emitters, and we've got construction material manufacturers. Every single link in that supply chain has a really valid reason to work with us, because, you know, in the mining sector, they've got liabilities associated with their existing mining tailings. We can remove those liabilities, actually turn them into money. whilst making them safe. They also have a real need for the sort of metals that we can extract, such as nickel and cobalt, which are really key metals for battery technologies. So demand for those materials is increasing. Investor sentiment around investing in new mining solutions are waning because of the problems associated with liabilities around mining tailings, for one thing, but also, you know, the whole idea of mining is really sort of counter to environmental standards. So all new mining operations really now have to be climate smart, and unless companies and mining companies can demonstrate that new mining operations are going to have very low impact on the environment, they don't get the investment that they need. So they're really keen to work with us to develop these sort of technologies. Emitters obviously are needing to reduce their emissions to net zero, so they're under a lot of pressure, both from the investors, but also from governments and also from their customers. So they're really motivated to work with us. In the construction sector, again, major sources of emissions. So from the point of view of emissions, they're also an emissions customer. But they also, their customers are looking for building materials that are have lower embedded CO2. So anything they can do to reduce the emissions generated through construction and making of the construction materials is welcome. However, you know, the very fact that we need this supply chain is actually a real problem for us, because, you know, we're having to bring together all these different industries, and who moves first. You know, the whole thing doesn't make sense unless the whole of the supply chain is in place. So it's very difficult to sort of try to bring all these disparate industries together, each with their own sort of risk profiles. A lot of them are established businesses. They don't like new technologies. You know, they've been used to sort of small innovations around the processes that are already established. You bring in a new process to them, and they're really quite nervous of it, and they demand very high, sort of highly developed technologies that are close to commercialization before they're prepared to sort of dip their hands in their pockets and start investing in it. And at the same time, you know, investors from the normal routes are really struggling to find fun in them to take on these sort of investments, because, you know, developing a technology at the scale that we're talking about, I mean, we're talking about developing plant at a scale that was used in cement manufacturing industries, for instance, and a cement works can cost $1 billion. So, you know, to make our first plant, you know, we're going to have to be sort of looking for that sort of scale of investment, and you know, it's going to take many years to recoup that investment, and you know, to develop the technology, and it's still very high risk. So, and we're also working in untested markets with customers that are very risk averse. So for a sort of a VC investor, it's really unattractive. So we're stuck in this sort of valley of death situation, and we're really having to work very hard to bring together all these different sectors in our supply chain to help to share that risk. Also, we're sort of working with governments, trying to get government funding to sort of bridge this gap and to take on some of that risk. And you know, we're making some good progress in that respect. It's slow, but you know, we're trying to do some quite difficult stuff here. But you know, we're finally starting to make some really good headway. But you know, the major sort of step forward really has been in the finance sector, and we can really sort of thank Mark Carney for this. Now most large corporates have to report on their carbon emissions, not only just carbon emissions from their direct operations, but also from their supply chains, and also from the users of their particular product. And this is really starting to change attitude towards this. We're also getting investment funds. Even Cambridge University, who's not known for their sort of forward-looking investments ideas, are starting to divest of fossil fuel assets, etc. And you know, it's really encouraging to see this shift. And because at the board level, strategic decisions are starting to be made about where to put money, and we're starting to see a lot more interest. But we're also starting to look at innovative finance models, where we're looking at bringing all these different industries together and sharing risk amongst them. So we're looking at clustering of different industries within certain geographical areas, sorry, and sort of, again, sharing risk, bringing government money, leveraging that with investment from each of these different industries. And we're really starting to start seeing some progress in that. So it's a really, really interesting time, actually, for us, and one we're really starting to feel very, very much more comfortable with, and more enthusiastic about the future as a result of that. So, so it's an interesting world we're living in at the moment. And as the great David Attenborough said, Garden of Eden that we've been so used to sort of providing for us is no more. We've destroyed it, basically, and we need to fix it. So more and more of our attention now is being focused at actually removal of CO2 from the atmosphere, because there's a sort of an appreciation now that we've already emitted too much CO2 for a stable environment. So we have to start looking at climate repair, and Cambridge University, thankfully, is starting to move in this direction. There's a whole new initiative right across all the departments of Cambridge University, led by Professor Sir David King and others, to actually address these issues and try to bring back a stable environment. So, interesting times. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. That was a really interesting talk. We have a couple of questions for you before we move on to the general Q&A. So but the first one is, could you recycle gaseous CO2 into greenhouses?
Well, again, I mean, why would you do that? Okay, so you get your plants growing a bit faster or a bit bigger, but that CO2 is still getting out there. You're only delaying its release, really, when you're looking at putting it into plants, because those plants are either eaten or disposed of, and they break down to form methane and other sort of greenhouse gases. So you're not really taking any CO2 out of the environment when you're doing that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So got a question from Faisal. What would the ideal way to carbon capture? Sorry, what would be the ideal way to carbon capture where we do not need additional energy to do it?
Well, I mean, some of the sort of ideas that we're looking at with the Institute for Climate Repair with Cambridge University is actually spreading magnesium hydroxide or magnesium-rich minerals across beaches around the world. And here we're using wave action to sort of agitate the surface, getting a lot of sort of weathering that's happening. And it's a way of just enhancing the weathering effect to draw down CO2 from the atmosphere. We're also looking at the idea of actually pumping magnesium hydroxide up into the upper atmosphere, where we can get some cloud whitening, which obviously reflects a lot of the heat away. But as it falls back down to through the atmosphere, it's effectively scrubbing CO2 from the air, creating magnesium bicarbonates, which then flow with rivers down to the sea, where they form magnesium carbonates. This has the added advantage also of addressing ocean acidification as well. So these are all really sort of big ideas, and probably we're going to have to resort to these sort of technologies and approaches if we're to stabilize the planet again. So these are all being discussed. It's going to require a significant amount of agreement across different nations, because we're messing around with the Earth. We don't own it. Britain doesn't own the Earth. We used to own a third of it, didn't we, back in the good old days, but good old bad days. We need strong international cooperation in order to do that. And right now, I don't see that happening anytime soon. So we must address the emissions that we have today. So we have to stop digging, basically, stop digging the hole that we're already in. That's the first step. So tackling emissions, I think, is step one. Step two is then about drawing down CO2 levels in the atmosphere.
Great, thank you. This kind of leads on to the next question, which is, can you think of any ways of capturing CO2 that haven't been invested in due to high risks? I think you touched upon that in your talk as well.
well as our technology, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, we are open to anybody who would like to invest in us to help us on our journey. So I mean, we've been looking at a number of areas, such as energy storage, for instance, using compressed air. So we liquefy air to have a sort of energy storage media, which is very interesting. It's a great complement to renewable energy, which is not always produced when you need it. So a great way of tackling climate change is to use renewable energy. And one of the reasons that we're sort of still quite sort of stuck with fossil fuel derived electricity, for instance, is because the wind doesn't always blow, and when it does blow, it doesn't always blow when you need electricity. So you know, there is this mismatch of supply and demand. So storage technology is going to be absolutely essential. And one of my favourites is compressed air or liquefied air. It's a great way of storing energy.
Great, thank you. I think Alice asks, what's your opinion of blue carbon or carbon sequestered by mangrove forests?
Oh, hang on, there's two different things. So blue hydrogen is basically hydrogen derived from fossil fuels, but with carbon capture. And you know, there's lots of talk about the hydrogen economy, and most people think that, oh, we can use wind turbines and solar panels to generate hydrogen. Yes, we can, but not at the sort of scale that's going to be needed to displace existing fossil fuels. So if we are serious about hydrogen economy, there is certainly in the transition phases very high demand for what they call blue hydrogen, which is basically fossil fuel derived hydrogen, but with carbon capture. So there's a very large role for that in going forward. The other thing that you mentioned, I've forgotten now. What was that?
Carbon sequestration by mangrove forests.
Oh, mangrove forests. Yeah. So, you know, again, this is sort of a remediation idea using nature, and we absolutely have to do that where we can. And there's lots of other reasons why you'd want mangroves to grow again, because you know they're fantastic for protection against rising sea levels as well, and storm surges, etc. So it's essential for the protection of low-lying lands. It's also from an ecology point of view, you know, the habitats for some wonderful creatures that we need to encourage greater numbers of. And so we must do everything we can to grow more forests, to grow more mangroves, to grow more wetlands, to do all these things that we've been routinely destroying for profit. We need to reverse that. So there is a place for that.
Great, thank you. And I think final question we'll do for your Q&A is from Tove. How do you think businesses can influence governments or other business sectors to drive this change?
Well, I think, like I said, I name-checked Mark Carney, who was the former governor of the Bank of England, Canadian by birth, and fantastic contribution he's made through making the Stern report, which was basically looking at the costs of climate change, central to all sort of business planning, particularly in investment, where sustainability of the environment is linked to the sustainability of the business. You could argue that fossil fuel companies could keep on selling their oil and burning it, but at some point, the populations that are their customers are going to sort of reduce to a level which can't sustain their business. So obviously there's a finite limit to growth, and that has been reached. So companies need to start thinking and planning for the future in order to maintain the shareholder value. And I think that, above all else, above any sort of political will, is what's going to start motivating change. And governments respond to industry. So if industry leads, governments follow.
Great, thank you. So now over to our general Q&A. So we're more than happy to accept further questions from the audience. And we've also got a couple of questions that are more general. So I think we'll start with you, Michael, as you're already here speaking. So why did you choose to become an entrepreneur? And since our audience is quite student heavy, do you have any advice for future entrepreneurs who would like to follow in your footsteps?
Okay, I sort of fell into being an entrepreneur by accident, really. It was driven by the ideas. You know, I had all these different ideas that I wanted to explore, and could see that they would be really sort of quite commercially valuable ideas. And I found that, you know, the only way that I could make them commercially viable is if I sort of took the lead and basically tried to form those businesses around the ideas. So I sort of grew into being an entrepreneur from the ideas, really. So I would say I'm firstly an innovator and an entrepreneur by necessity. It's actually quite good fun. And I think in terms of, you know, students looking at future careers, I would certainly recommend having a mission. I think a mission makes life a lot more interesting. If you feel that your life has a purpose, it does help hugely with sort of getting through difficult times, and there's going to be some very difficult times ahead of us. So if you have a mission, if you have something you really believe in, it'll get you through those hard times and through to future success as well. So certainly my mission is climate change and preventing destruction of the environment, whilst also, you know, recognizing the need for industry and, you know, enjoying the benefits of it. You know, this is my way of making it okay to have a nice car. Not I've got one yet, but yeah, one day I'll hope to have a nice car, and you know, I'd feel quite justified in having a nice car if I've managed to achieve you know, reductions in carbon from the industries that created it.
Great, thank you so much. It was really lovely to have you with us tonight. And I think I'd like to move on and ask David the same. So what inspired you to be an academic and entrepreneur, and what advice would you have for fellow students?
So I never intended to be an entrepreneur, I suppose. But I am always attracted to applied questions. One of the things that I've learnt very quickly is that actually there's a real risk of being an academic boffin and thinking that if you do all the research, you know what the right questions are, and therefore you'll identify the questions and address those questions yourselves without ever actually interacting with key stakeholders and end users. And so one of the things I've learned very quickly actually is that you engage with the people that are going to use your ideas and implement your suggestions from the outset, so that you make sure you're asking the right questions. And that probably is one of the best pieces of advice and guidance I can give, is that you know, don't develop ideas in isolation. Engage with your end users and stakeholders from the outset, and you will then make sure that you're addressing the right questions, and you're developing solutions that are fit for purpose. I mean, it's quite difficult being an academic and also having a commercial wing. I've certainly found this, in that there is certainly an attitude within academia that doing applied work can sometimes be a bit of a sellout, and that you're maybe not being a rigorous academic if you're addressing applied questions. I certainly don't believe that, because I think that actually from a lot of fundamental science, applied questions emerge, and that both applied and pure science are compatible and should be unified. Not that I'm saying that every academic should be applied, but I think that you know, it certainly for me, it gives me a lot of reward to think about applications. So as far as why did I become an entrepreneur, I don't know. I guess that I've always been interested in application of science, and that's it really. And advice for entrepreneurs and innovators: don't do it in isolation. Engage with end users and stakeholders so that you ensure that what you're doing is fit for purpose.
Great, thank you so much. This question I had was, do you find there's kind of a conflict of interest between your academic and entrepreneurial side of work, especially when presenting your work to academics? Do they feel that, you know, your entrepreneurial side is kind of taking over almost?
The biggest conflict of interest is the metrics by which academics are assessed and progress through the career ranks are made, I think, because certainly historically the metrics for academia for progress were research grants and research publications. And one of the challenges with doing applied work in particular is that some of your juiciest findings are things that are commercially sensitive, and so you can't publish readily. And so there is that potential constraint. I mean, I think there's also an issue that if you're doing work which is publicly funded, then I think, you know, that you have a duty to make that information publicly available and exploitable. So there are challenges, but in fact, one of the major metrics we're assessed by in academia is something called the Research Excellence Framework, and that now does take account of impact in its broadest sense. It doesn't have to be commercial impact; it can be societal impact, for instance. But that is starting to make academic institutions pay a little bit more attention to the applied aspects that academics are doing. So I think there's a change afoot in the way that applied work is considered within academia, but there's certainly still a component of my academic colleagues, I think, who would consider that applied work, particularly if it has commercial relevance, is not the direction that we should be going. But from a personal perspective, I'm happy with the balance that I strike.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us this evening. It was really lovely to have you.
Thank you.
And finally, turning to Ting, pretty much the same question. So what inspired you to be an entrepreneur, and what would be your advice for students?
Yeah, I think for me personally, I know it was said already, but definitely being kind of mission focused. You know, I spent about 5 years working specifically in population health consulting, seeing, you know, a lot of rises in healthcare costs around the world, especially due to chronic disease, and was really inspired by, you know, becoming an entrepreneur to specifically look at that issue and around the world to improve quality of life for people, while also kind of driving down healthcare costs as much as possible, to make the whole kind of ecosystem just more sustainable. So I think, you know, that was really kind of one of my main drivers to being an entrepreneur. And I think, you know, advice for students, I wasn't a student not too long ago. I literally just finished my master's at Cambridge 2 years ago. And, you know, I think one of my main bits of advice is, you know, find a great co-founder that you can definitely trust and you respect and value. You know, I thankfully have managed to do that with my co-founder Nasha, who's also on this call as well. But you know, other bits of advice that I think is, you know, has been crucial for us is knowing specifically, you know, who our technology is benefiting, and, you know, having those conversations specifically with those asthma patients, and, you know, how they live with their conditions, what they'd want to know, and, you know, developing our solution in tandem with them, and really listening to patient voices and putting that at front and center is something that's really critical to our mission.
Great, thank you so much. This is kind of a question we had earlier, and it kind of follows on nicely. Is that so? You mentioned how you require a lot of data over a long period of time to look at individual risks and monitor health risks.
Yeah.
So would you be doing this on your own, or would you be like looking to collaborate with academia and academic studies?
Yeah, definitely collaborating with academic studies. There's a lot of academic studies ongoing across the world, especially in China and India at the moment, that are looking at correlating kind of exposures to things like particulate matter, to things like nitrogen oxides, and the health impact that that has. So, you know, definitely looking to collaborate with those researchers, but also with other kind of private digital health platforms. You know, we've been working with one of the largest respiratory digital health platforms, who have specifically looked at, for example, the correlations between PM 2.5 exposure and increased usage of reliever inhalers. So, you know, we're working in tandem with them to provide additional objective data points in terms of, okay, with those increased usage of reliever inhalers, was that due to any particular drop in blood oxygenation levels or increase in respiratory rates following this PM 2.5 exposure, and whether or not we can see that across a population scale and push forward kind of research in this area.
Amazing, thank you so much. I'd like to thank all our speakers again for being with us today, and our participants as well for joining, and I hope you all have a very lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining. Just a quick shout out to our next event on the 30th of October about gene therapy. So we look forward to hosting you then. Thank you again for everyone for attending. Bye bye.